Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It is my absolute honor today to introduce our fantastic panel. We have Alexandra Cousteau, who's not only a board member of NEOM, but a woman who's absolutely active from the minute she wakes up until she sleeps in saving our oceans. She comes from the great legacy of the Cousteau family, and it's an absolute honor for us to have you here with us today.
Thank you.
We also have Mark Dalio, the co-founder of OceanX. We have John Pagano with us, who is the CEO of the Red Sea Development Company. We have Fahim Qasimi, founder of Seafood Souq, which I'm very excited for you all to hear about. And we also have Dr. Vincent Pieribone, who is the vice chairman of OceanX. So ladies and gentlemen, we've been talking about sustainability. We've been talking about the future. You've heard people talk about ESG and crypto and all of these fantastic things. We've talked about the regeneration of nature on Earth. But I wonder if people, when they think about regeneration in nature, if they think only about land. And you are 5 experts in the value from the private sector to the public sector, from the heart and soul of what is actually happening in our oceans and our seas and why we need to preserve them. So I'd love to hear from each of you in conversation, why is this panel important to all of us today?
Thank you, and hello everyone. Thank you for being here. I know it's the end of a long day, so we appreciate you joining us for this conversation about our oceans. And as Princess Reema mentioned, I've been in the ocean space my entire life. My grandfather taught me to scuba dive when I was 7 years old in the Mediterranean. And in the time since my grandfather invented scuba diving in the 1950s, we have lost half of our oceans, half of the whales and fish and creatures that lived there when he first started exploring have disappeared. And so I think the question now before us is, how will we move into the future? You know, the oceans are a huge part of our global economy that are often overlooked. They're the least funded of the UN SDGs, relying almost exclusively on philanthropy. And the truth is that science tells us we can rebuild our oceans within 1 human generation to the abundance that my grandfather once knew. So what it will take to get there, I think, is this understanding that to get to a better place, we need a vision of where to go. And then we need to align to be able to collaborate towards realizing that vision of a more abundant future. Interestingly, science also shows us that for every $1 invested in oceans, you get a $10 return. So oceans is not just a money pit for us to throw philanthropic dollars into. It's actually an extraordinary opportunity for creative investments and financial tools to be able to rebuild the natural resources that so many communities around the world depend on. And I think that for us right now, it's an incredibly exciting time looking at new technologies, innovation, ingenuity, tools in the financial sector, new ideas. There is an extraordinary opportunity today for us to come together and rebuild our ocean in a way that derives benefits for all stakeholder groups.
Great. So Mark, why now? Why here?
I think for us, we're all about really how do you explore the world's oceans and bring back to the world. So by that I mean, how do we further our scientific knowledge and our discovery about what is out there, and how do we contribute more to that? And then how do we engage the public? Because I think there's so much that science can do in terms of showing the data that will allow us to make the right choices and kind of go in the right direction, but without empowering those scientists with great stories, with public engagement and excitement for the next generation to get involved, then I think it will fall on flat ears and not really be able to drive the message forward and the work that we need to do in inspiring the public to get involved and be involved.
Great.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you for staying so late. To get some energy in the room, Your Royal Highness, can I break the fourth wall? My name is Fahim Qasimi. I'm the co-founder of Seafood Souq. We're a technology company and proudly a portfolio company of FII. Who here eats fish? Who here asks where their fish comes from? And because you don't, we have very opaque supply chains that have a lot of bad actors. Our technology company, founded in the region for the world, builds traceability from source to end customer, so you know exactly what you're eating. With that, we're providing data, supply chain resiliency, and supply chain transparency for a $1.8 trillion economy. To leave you with this, why now? Is because a third of the world relies on seafood as a main form of protein or income, and it's predominantly in emerging markets. It's a problem that was caused by business and needs to be solved by business. Sean and I, my co-founder, were inspired by the work that your grandfather did and you're doing now, Mark, and we realized that we needed to take a stand on how to solve the ocean's problems, stop overfishing, and we're proudly doing it from the Middle East.
Look, and good evening, everybody. And again, let me add my thanks as well for sticking around. It's been a long day. Look, I think I'm going to pick up on what Alexandra said. And I'll say something that I often say, some might think of it as being controversial. Sustainability is no longer enough. We at the Red Sea have been promoting a narrative around regenerative development. And what do I mean by that? Sustainability is maintaining the status quo, not making a mess of the place. But if we've lost half of our oceans already, I mean, what's valuable to us in those oceans, maintaining the status quo is not the answer for the future. Now is the time for us to act. What we're doing at the Red Sea, we started with the premise that we actually valued our natural capital. The oceans for us is one of our unique differentiators in a crowded global marketplace. So as a private investor or private sector representative, we see the value. And we're not simply just saying, okay, let's leave things as they are. We are proactively looking at ways to deal with overfishing in our area because fish stocks are depleted. Dealing with the fishermen in a positive sense to help educate them that their practices are not sustainable. They're damaging the corals, which are the lungs of the ocean. And, you know, coral reefs are the lifeline of the oceans. They represent a mere 0.25%, but they support 25% of marine life. And if we don't do anything, in the coming decades, we'll lose all of it. So we're looking at ways to actually grow more coral, grow more habitats to really increase the health of our oceans. We have to take the view that treating the symptoms is not the answer. We've got to get to the root cause of what it is that's causing these stressors on our oceans. And it doesn't start in the oceans. It does start on land. You know, greenhouse gases, we need to start to reverse that because the acidification of the oceans is causing some of our challenges. We need to deal with overfishing. We need to deal with surface runoff, which creates other challenges in the oceans. So that's what we're trying to do with Red Sea. We're using the platform that the Saudi Arabia has provided us as a driver for change within the global development community to say there is a better way, and the oceans are an incredibly important part of our sustainability as humans, not in the sustainable sense.
Okay, Dr. Vincent.
Yeah, we at OceanX have had a series of research vessels that we've traveled around the world. So we've sort of firsthand witnessed the ocean, probably in more detail than just about anyone. So following in the footsteps again of original Cousteau, traveling the world, seeing, taking a vessel, taking like a research laboratory. And I have to say, as a scientist and as an entrepreneur and as a thinker of the future, to me the ocean has always been this wealth of information, this wealth of biological diversity, which has incredible actual value to the human endeavor. It'll have more value to the human endeavor probably in the next 15 years. If you look at pharmaceutical development in the years past, it was all small molecules, it was all chemistry. Now more and more of the portfolios are growing into biologics, and biologics are derived from material that comes out of the living world, and the ocean is the absolute best place for that. So it's just one of the many slivers of value that the ocean provides us for this aspect of it being a diverse ecosystem. that has value to humans, in my mind, has been everywhere we go in the world, in the ocean, we see this. We see this massive variance, this massive biological diversity that is progressively becoming more valuable on that level, not only from a perspective of the importance of these basic features about producing oxygen, producing food, pulling carbon, the things that it does is fantastic. It has this large potential for the future. And so why now? And to me, in some senses, obviously the ocean is in peril. Most of these coastal ecosystems are in peril. The water levels are rising, things are changing, but the ocean itself is finally becoming into reach because technology allows us to get in there. For years, the ocean was very impenetrable because you can't get radio waves, there's no GPS, there's all these features of the ocean that make it very difficult to explore. But recently, with recent technology and ways to get into the ocean, it's certainly opening up to us in ways that hasn't happened before. We spent 18 weeks in the Saudi Red Sea this year, mapping and studying the entire coastline and sort of revealing this entire unknown world that's been off the shores of Saudi Arabia for so many years. And again, we weren't familiar with that water body, but coming there and learning about all the diversity of it, actually traveling up and down along the Red Sea Development Corp, NEOM, and all these developments along the way, it's an unbelievable resource. And our mandate coming from above was study this, understand it, so that we can protect it and we can pass it on for generations of Saudis. So we're honored and glad to do that. And seeing that as we get in the water, how amazing and beautiful that is. When you live your life in that, there really is no other course of action but to sustain and again, rebuild that resource.
So I've heard all of you talk about technology, and I have also seen that many times the private sector is vilified for its destruction of natural ecosystems. We have two shining examples of how, from the Red Sea Development Project and also from the work that you're doing, how do you use technology to create your projects to be sustainable, and what innovations have actually been born out of your private sector initiatives that add value to the world of research? Because people forget, in order for you to thrive, the product needs to be there, and part of your product is the seafood, and part of your product is actually the ecosystem that exists there. How do you answer and push back on your part of the problem?
Do you want to go first, or?
Happy for you to go.
Thank you. The one thing that we've realized as we've grown our business is that the oceans and the marine ecosystems are extremely complex. Just look at this panel today. We have people that come from all different backgrounds trying to solve, this very challenging issue of the oceans. In that complexity, there was a need for us to improve the current practices, but you can't improve what you can't measure. And that, for us, I think, is an extremely important part of what we do. We have a technology-led business that is data-driven, that helped found the GDST, the Global Dialogue on Seafood Traceability, that today is being adopted by the FDA in the US. We only trade traceable fish. It's the first step towards more sustainable, more transparent, more resilient supply chains. And I think taking an industry like the seafood industry, that is one of the oldest and probably most analog industries, and digitizing it was something that we knew would be the first step of many, working with partners like people on this stage, to try to improve it. You touched on one thing that I think is extremely important, is that it is still business-led.
Yeah.
Our platform is a business-to-business platform. The consumers can drive change. We use traceability in the leading hotel brands in the world. We are deploying very proudly traceability across a few projects that we're not allowed to announce yet here in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. But keep watching this space. We need to learn more, and I'm sure you'll agree that data is what we don't have enough of.
Yeah, on the other side of that story is that if you look at fisheries, many fisheries, the sort of amount of effort you put in, the amount of fish you get out used to be a linear process. Now, most fisheries are on the other side of that linear process. More work being put in, less fish gotten out. So where we all want to be really is on the top of that process. We want to be in the place where we're putting in minimal effort and getting maximum yield and maintaining the fish population. That position just happens to be the place that's the most sustainable for fisheries. So most of the fisheries are in that other side of the so they're spending more money, more effort, and getting less out. And it's a data weak area. And so new technology is important to sort of map out where those fish are, because they're very moving around quickly and they go across borders and everything. So new technology that OceanX and other partners are working on are sort of chasing and tracking those fish to find out where they are and what kind of policies you can put in place to get us back to the peak of production and with minimum effort.
I think one of the things that's so interesting about fisheries is that the oceans are remarkably resilient when we recreate the conditions for them to thrive and flourish. And so with fisheries, we see time and time again with species after species that once you take your foot off the gas and you do some simple things, you implement science-based quotas, you decrease bycatch, and you increase marine protected areas, those species that were overfished start to come back. And so one of the really hopeful things, I think, is that most of the fisheries exist within countries' exclusive economic zones, and the vast majority of fishing is done by about 30 countries around the world, 90%. So we have an opportunity to influence those countries using seafood transparency and traceability to help us have a view into what's really happening and encourage people to make better decisions. And if we do that, we can see that fisheries will come back. And what happens when fisheries come back? Not only can we feed more people, and if we had abundant fisheries, we could feed up to 1 billion people at one seafood meal a day, mostly in the developing world, which would be twice as much as we're capable of doing now. That creates jobs, that creates economy, that creates all of these things, and it creates hospitality opportunities. And it also means that there's more fish in the ocean for the predators to have, right? For the sharks and the sea lions and animals that are struggling now to find food because we've overfished. And so we see that in an abundant ocean, if that is our goal, we're able to meet all of our own requirements as human societies and have a more abundant ecosystem as a result. And that is truly extraordinary because it's not something that people assume to be true. They assume if we eat fish, there will be less fish. Well, in fact, if we manage our fisheries properly, with the help of these new technologies, we can have more fish, feed more people, and have a more abundant ecosystem. So
which is, I feel, John,
really
what you've done. I feel like you're the living embodiment of what everybody has just said could be.
No, absolutely. Look, and you know, I often say we're inspired by nature but led by science. I mean, before we put a shovel in the ground or on the islands, we studied our destination in meticulous detail. We used data and technology to determine where to develop and where not to develop. We undertook a marine spatial planning simulation, the largest ever undertaken, of the entire lagoon area, which is this is categorized as a critical habitat because it's all interlinked. What you do in one place affects another. And we made decisions based around and led by the science. We have islands that are beautiful islands that you would, as a developer, you would wish to develop, but for the fact that if you develop that island, you displace a species that is on the verge of extinction. So, we very much used science to inform the decisions we were making. And I don't want this thing to be about fisheries, sorry, but we are subject to a depletion of especially the larger predator fish because they are overfished and they appear in some of the markets, which is staggering to me, and we've got to stamp that out. We're going to use marine protected areas to start dealing with that. But in terms of tech that we're trying to develop, we're trying to grow coral in a laboratory environment. We're blessed here in the Red Sea, especially in the northern parts, where we have thriving coral reefs, and it's against all the odds, right? We have warmer sea temperatures, we have higher salinity, yet the coral is thriving. And so it's a huge effort and body of research that we are undertaking along with some of our partners to understand why. Because if we can unlock the DNA drivers behind that, maybe we export that and we offer hope to the rest of the world, the Great Barrier Reef, the reefs in the Caribbean, and others in the Indian Ocean. So we're exploring through science and technology. There is a lack of data that I think, with the work that OceanX is doing is going to help give us more tools. We're going to use data and tech to monitor the environment because a lot of what we're doing, we don't know really what the consequences are going to be. And so through the combination of the Internet of Things, artificial intelligence, machine learning, we're going to be able to pick up changes in our environment so that we can react before we create any kinds of lasting damages. So, I mean, tech is a big part of how we protect our oceans going forward, and it's embedded in everything that we do at the Red Sea.
If I can just jump in, as the small technology company that's growing by comparison to these very experienced heavyweights around me, I will say that what I think John is trying to say, though he's being too humble, is it takes leadership. It takes leadership to put the oceans first. You know, we're inspired by the work that you do, OceanX, the Cousteau family, of course, and what you're doing at NEOM, but also Red Sea, is for us as business partners in helping protect our oceans and helping stop overfishing and helping protect these environments. It takes leadership, and it changes by country. You know, here in Saudi Arabia, we get to work with fantastic, projects that are looking, at developing on the coast. In other parts of the world, it means working with government. I'm sure, Mark, you've experienced the same thing with, depending on where you're going and researching, there seems to be a different leader in all those spaces.
Absolutely. I think for us, too, that the leadership will put the pressure that it needs if the public is really asking the hard questions. And I think to your point is, if people weren't asking where their seafood was coming, then it would put you out of business. But the fact that the people are actually asking where their seafood is coming is why we need organizations like you to actually allow for a more sustainable way of managing the fisheries.
You know, what strikes me from what you were saying, John, and some of the other comments on this panel is that we often look at the environment as something we need to exploit for profit. And we say, the cost to the environment is just an outcome of building our economy. Mm-hmm. And I think that, what you were saying, John, turns that completely around. We cannot accept that destroying the environment is a requirement for having a successful economy. It's quite the opposite. The economy is a wholly owned subsidiary of a healthy environment. Yeah. And by rebuilding that environment, we are creating more opportunity for economic growth, not less. And what you're doing and the Red Sea Project and what I've been fortunate enough to watch over the past 5 years that I've been on the board of NEOM is this principle of putting nature first, putting the ocean first. At NEOM, they are putting 95% of NEOM as a nature reserve, both land and ocean. And that's an extraordinary piece of leadership and an example for the rest of the world, in my opinion.
So interestingly, you've all touched on this concept of leadership and governance. In which way do we need more governance, and in which way do we need less regulation to allow for each of your chosen paths to thrive? And I'd also love to know, from your points of view, how do you monetize? Because unfortunately, money talks. How do you create that monetization or the will to invest in clean oceans and the industries around clean oceans? Because as I look at the future investment, to your point, people say, Reema, there's no money in it. I'm like, well, there's got to be money in it if you think that you'll actually lose everything if we don't have clean oceans. Like, I don't know how people have detached this psychologically. So how do we tie this back together?
Well, one of the interesting things that we've been working on at Oceans 2050 is creating a voluntary carbon protocol for seaweed farming. Mm-hmm. So we did the first ever global scientific study of the carbon sequestration of seaweed farms, from a 300-year-old farm in Japan to a much newer farm in Alaska and in locations around the world. And we found that in many cases, seaweed farms sequester even more carbon than the Amazon rainforest. And so creating that voluntary carbon protocol will allow people to start monetizing seaweed farming as a way to help offset carbon emissions. Now, is this, the solution for reducing our carbon emissions? It's not the ultimate solution, of course, but it can help to drive the development and scaling of seaweed farming, which is extraordinary. In our farms, we had about 23,000 farmers represented. 60% of them were women, and a lot of those women had brought their husbands, who were fishermen and whose fishing had collapsed, into the seaweed farming business with them. So for communities, for the ocean, as habitat for biodiversity, seaweed farming is an extraordinary avenue towards a more abundant ocean. It is on that pathway towards abundance, which is a fundamentally different pathway than the exploitative blue economy that we've been creating for the past 50 years. And I think that that is one way we've been looking at helping create those financial mechanisms to drive investment into regenerative activities in the ocean that help people and the ocean to thrive. And that is just one example of many ways that we can do that. And it's exciting to see those things start to, surface in the marketplace.
No, absolutely, and we recognize that as well. I think the carbon offset market is a great way to bring investment into the blue economy. Growing mangroves, much like the seagrasses, are great sequesters of carbon. They protect us from sea level rise. They protect us from erosion, and so that's a great driver of potentially bringing capital into poor parts of the world that could really benefit from that, and it allows the transition, which is going to take time, away from fossil fuels, the ability to offset that, and so that we're mitigating those effects. But I want to go back to what Mark said. I think at the end of the day, and it's not about governments can only do so much. I think the power of the people is what ultimately is going to drive the investment in the protection and the enhancements of the oceans. I think the past several years with COVID has really caused us to all pause and reflect on what's important to us in life. And we've come to realize that nature and the environment is so precious to us and is so essential to our ability to survive that consumers are going to hopefully start to vote with their wallets. And and that's what we represent, if we offer people a choice that is doing the right things by protecting the oceans, by protecting the environment, my hope is that we put pressure on others to follow, because if you don't follow us, you're going to go out of business. And I think that could be perhaps the most compelling thing to really bring about the change that we need. And we're in crisis, as we all know on this panel.
And John, I think that's exactly right. And we've been talking about technology for exploring our ocean, technology for managing fisheries, but look at the technology you have in your pocket. I mean, we all use on a daily basis Uber and Airbnb and Amazon and all of these other platforms that create a seamless experience for us to be able to obtain goods and services that we require in a couple swipes. But that's really incredible technology behind it. It's sophisticated, it's required large amounts of investment to develop, but that technology is now ubiquitous. However, when it comes to the environment, there's a huge gap. There's no technology like it that can help us to rebuild our oceans and make it possible for every individual to have a meaningful role in rebuilding a place in the ocean, a coral, a seagrass meadow, a salt marsh. And so I think that there is definitely a need to bridge that gap and start to look at what kinds of technologies can help people participate in the rebuilding, because Generation Z, their number one concern is environment and climate change. They're experiencing climate anxiety, all of these different things, and there is no meaningful way for them to be heard, to be seen, and to participate. I mean, recently they've been throwing food at priceless works of art as a cry for help and a desperate way to get attention. But what if we made it easy for them to take meaningful action? And what if we developed these tools that allow them to do something in the real world and measure that progress, measure that contribution? So I think that there's things that we can still work on developing that can get us there, and that's where we'll see change.
I have this personal experience of having grown up in Florida as a child, and I was diving in the 70s in Florida, and had the unique chance to go back to Florida with OceanX on our vessel. And the difference in that environment from the 70s till now is dramatic. And from an investment perspective, comparing to what John and teams are doing on the Red Sea, developing at a later stage, Florida had one of the largest economies around scuba diving, around ocean utilization, around fishing. They overdid everything, like the worst possible way. And all the investment in that region is failing, right? Because they no longer have an environment, they no longer have a reef, they no longer have fish, they no longer have clear water, they're having algae blooms. So all that real estate and all that work and all that investment in that area is at a serious risk because the environment is falling apart underneath them from years of inactivity. So when I come to the Red Sea and I see new development and seeing it take this entirely different approach, the approach that they're taking, radically different, and viewing this as an asset. And a large fish in the ocean now swimming around John's property is a lot more valuable than taking those large fish out of the water and eating them. In that sense, ones like sharks and things which don't have any necessary commercial value. So seeing this destruction and loss of value in Florida and coming here and seeing this radically different approach to doing it, I think he's caring for that investment in a way that's going to matter. The hotels are going to go in, the houses are going to go in, but then what happens when that's done? We did that really well in Florida, putting all that stuff in, but at the expense of the environment. So I think there's a lot more to be said about how that's done.
Having said that, the one thing I will say answering your question on regulation is, with all due respect to that shark, or that big fish are migratory species. Have you ever Googled, sorry, audience participation, Google the world according to a fish, and you'll see how fish see the world. Countries need to work together. Saudi Arabia is not the only country on the Red Sea. True. And I think that's the part that becomes extremely challenging. When you work in regions, when you work, the ocean's a shared asset. Alexandra, you alluded to this. This is not something that belongs to one country or one person. So we need more coordination.
Yeah.
What is the number that we can put to it? I'll be quick because we're running out of time. $1.8 trillion economy in the seafood industry. Traceability will add 600 billion according to recent reports. That is, at a very macro level, it sounds fantastic. I'll tell you today we worked with Poland line fishing, with small-scale fisheries here in the Arabian Gulf. We were very proud to say that the same fishermen moving from nets to lines increased their catch from 75 cents a kilo to about $14 a kilo. By using line fishing, no bycatch, they catch less fish and they earn more money. But what they missed was the ability to prove that in the supply chain, because the minute it goes into that opaque supply chain, you actually don't know what you're eating. So I think that'll be the last thing I'll say today. I'd like to leave the audience with just that message to ask where your fish comes from, please. Not only for our business, but probably for your health as well.
So, Mark, why should they care?
I think one thing that was actually interesting, the correlation between you guys, was there's consumer choice, obviously, in that aspect, but you also have to think about the people that are in the jobs themselves and how to manage against that. And you can't offer a solution that doesn't offer that those people in those industries a way to transfer over. And I think seaweed actually was an interesting, rose something for me, which was there's this organization, as an example, in the east coast of the U.S. Called Green Wave that is actually taking fishing people in the fishing industry and small fishing vessels and offering kelp farming and ways to actually 3D farm the kelp, and then also other seafood aspects to that. And so that not only offers another pathway for consumers and how they approach it, but then also in terms of actual industry growth within and offering jobs that can be transferable to those, something that can actually have a sustainable impact. And to your point around the fishing vessels as well.
Well, that's important. I mean, you can't displace fishermen, have a livelihood, they need to feed their families. You just have to give them alternatives. In our case, the tourism industry is a great creator of jobs. And so we need rangers, we need people boat captains. We're hiring boat captains by the boatload, pardon the pun, because they know the waters better than anybody. And so we're giving them alternative forms of employment that'll allow them to maintain their families and their livelihoods. So you don't, or you get them to fish for plastic. Fish for plastic earn more than actually taking fish out of the sea. So we have to address that as in anything that we do, and that's certainly what we're doing with Red Sea. Is the S in ESG is an important part of what we're trying to do. But I've got one last thought, again, we are always focused on the symptoms. We've got to start to take collective responsibility. Every one of us has a role to play in this. We've got to stop the plastics, the single-use plastics. I read a statistic which shocked me that said by 2050, there could be more plastic in the ocean than fish. more plastic in the ocean than fish. We've got to deal with that. Because otherwise, everything else that we're trying to do is going to be in vain. Anyway, sorry.
But John, just a small teaser before we close. I'd say watch this space, because perhaps this time next year we'll be able to announce a project we've been dreaming up. But my ask of this audience is, you've sat here and you've been inspired and you've listened, but you're the investors and you're the business people that have the ability to make this change. And in that, consider your livelihood depends on the safety and the subsistence of the oceans. And just because you cannot see what's under there, don't think it doesn't exist. And we are dependent on it. So I would highly encourage you to reach out to these experts, to learn from them, and draw them into your businesses. If your bank's talking about ESG, these are your experts. If you're business people thinking how to give back, these are your experts. And if you're entrepreneurs thinking about how to create the next technologies, think of the oceans, because they are the unsung heroes of this world and this ecosystem, and they cannot speak for themselves. So I encourage you today to be the champions of the oceans. Thank you.